Good evening, and welcome to the University of New England's Harold Alfond Forum. I'm Jim Coble. I have the privilege of serving as the Provost and Senior Vice President of this university. I'd first like to request that you turn off your cell phones and note that only approved photographers may use flash photography. And if you are an approved photographer, you already know who you are. On behalf of the university, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 6th Annual University of New England George and Barbara Bush Distinguished Lecture, one of the highlights of our academic year. We have several UNE trustees and former trustees with us this evening, and I would ask those folks to please stand and be recognized. This particular lecture series is made possible through the generosity of Peter and Rosalind Whalen. Mr. and Mrs. Whalen, would you please stand so our audience may acknowledge you? We want to thank you for your ongoing support of the university and in particular this event. Thank you very much. Now, it is my honor to introduce the University of New England's 5th president, who is serving in her 10th year as our fearless leader. She has the distinct privilege of introducing some very special guests this evening. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Danielle Rippich.
Thank you, Provost Coble. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you here, our students, our faculty, staff, board members, and friends, to this 6th Annual George and Barbara Bush Distinguished Lecture at the University of New England. I am privileged to welcome back to campus two very special neighbors, dear friends of the University of New England, the 41st President of the United States of America, Mr. George Herbert Walker Bush, and Mrs. Barbara Bush. Welcome. President and Mrs. Bush, this is an important annual event for the university. The eminent speakers who have visited us through this lecture series have created a rich tradition of interesting, insightful lectures that have educated us and entertained us while enhancing our understanding of national and global politics. I know today's speakers will similarly enlighten us and look forward to introducing them to you shortly. But first, I'd like to reflect for a moment on the remarkable man and woman after which this series is named, for without them, we would not be here today. President Bush's inauguration, this is something I just learned this year, coincided with the 200th anniversary of the United States presidency. So when our nation's 41st president took the oath of office on that January day in 1989, he placed his hand on the very same Bible that George Washington used 200 years earlier in 1789. And America not only welcomed a new chief executive that day, but it celebrated the presidency's bicentennial. So it was truly a historic moment. President Bush entered the White House with a deep appreciation of the 40 presidents who had served before him and for the lessons he could learn. But President Bush also assumed office with a keen eye on the future. And I'm really always been taken by these words from his inaugural address. There is much to do, and tomorrow the work begins. I do not mistrust the future. I do not fear what is ahead, for our problems are large, but our heart is larger, and our challenges are great, but our will is greater. And so heart and will, they do represent the essence of the man and woman joining us here tonight. The former president and First Lady who I've had the privilege to get to know over the last decade have heart and will in abundance. Indeed, President and Mrs. Bush have forged their life's path following their hearts. And they haven't just followed a path, but they have followed it tenaciously. Their dedication to good work in their life has been remarkable. Among the highlights are the Points of Life Foundation, the world's largest organization dedicated to volunteer service, the Barbara Bush Children's Hospital here in Maine, and the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy that we have housed on our Portland campus are important contributions to the life of our citizens. Our UNE campus has also been graced by the Bush's generosity. The George and Barbara Bush Center stands as an enduring manifestation of President and Mrs. Bush's friendship and support for UNE. The Bush Legacy Gallery houses important presidential memorabilia from their life here in Maine, and we are thrilled to have a copy of the Resolute Desk. So for our new freshmen that are just on campus, we encourage you to come over and visit. There is exhibit space where we mount historic displays conveying the influence President and Mrs. Bush have had on Maine, across the country, and indeed on the globe. Thanks to a generous donation from the Bushes, we will be able to support programming with the Bush Presidential Library at Texas A&M University, and we are happy to have them also help support our distinguished lecture series. Our two lecturers tonight no doubt appreciate the opportunity each president has had to support the causes they hold most dear, and they understand that a president's influence does not end when his term ends. Ms. Nancy Gibbs and Michael Duffy, our speakers here tonight, have spent their careers studying and reporting on United States politics. Together, they have written the best-selling book titled The President's Club, Inside the World's Most Exclusive Fraternity, which will form the foundation of their lecture here this evening. Ms. Gibbs is the first woman to hold the position of managing editor at Time magazine. Introducing her tonight is really a special pleasure for me. When I was growing up, Time magazine came every week to my home in Southern Ohio, and my dad and I would read it. He took it very seriously and would quiz me on it at the dinner table. So this was something that introduced me into the larger world outside my small community. And to be able to introduce the first woman managing editor of this magazine that was held in such high esteem in my childhood growing up is something that I really hadn't imagined then, but I'm so thrilled to be able to do tonight. Ms. Gibbs, thank you for being here tonight as part of this esteemed lecture series, and personally, as I said, this is a real pleasure. And also, as Ms. Gibbs oversees Time magazine's domestic, international, and tablet editions, along with Time.com, Time Mobile, and Time for Kids, she is incredibly busy, and it's an amazing opportunity for you to have her here and to have her with us in Maine. She is one of the most published writers in Time's history, having served as the lead writer on virtually every major news event of the past 2 decades, including 4 presidential campaigns, and she has the lead cover story that just came out today on the visit of the Pope to the United States. So I encourage you to go get a copy. It's really exciting. Mr. Duffy, who is an Ohio native, so is also somebody that I share some Midwestern roots with, is the deputy managing editor of Time. And in a 30-year career with the magazine, he has covered the Pentagon, Congress, the White House, national politics, and national security. He has twice served as Time's Washington bureau chief, twice won the Gerald R. Ford Award in 1994 for his reporting on the White House, and in 2005 for his reporting on defense and national security. These 2 excellent journalists are here with us tonight, so please join me in welcoming them, Nancy Gibbs and Mr. Michael Duffy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, I am going first simply because in the relationship between Nancy and myself, I'm just the muscle, Nancy's really the brains, and I thought we'd get the muscle part over first and then the good stuff would come. So I'll be brief. I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you for that ridiculous introduction. And a special treat always to have, don't forget, we're here. This is a historic moment. There have only been 44, 43 if you only count Cleveland once. There have only been 44 presidents. One of them is here tonight. It's really a special privilege, and most people never get to have it. So don't forget that. Okay. We're going to talk about the presidents. We're going to talk about the ones that have come from Truman since, how they got along. When Nancy and I started covering presidents, we were intrigued by how they did their jobs, what it did to them as people, who they turned to for help, aside from their spouses, and what it was like to be in that special group. We meet our presidents face to face. They're talking to us. They want to tell us something. They want to convince us something. They talk to us directly. We rarely see them like this. Can you see the pictures? I see the pictures, but there they are. Thank you. We rarely see them like this, not talking to us, talking with each other. We thought if we could climb into this conversation, we might learn something about the nature of leadership, about the pressures of the job, about what it is these men, so far only men, have and that is special, and what they need from each other. And we thought that was a great enterprise if we could get it, and we could get them to talk about it a little bit. So what we did is we went back and we started with all the presidents from Truman all the way through to Obama to try to figure out what it is that makes them successful, what it is they need that they don't have, who they turn to for advice. And we found out quite often the answer is each other. I will remind you before we start that we are almost exactly 400 days away from another election. And it seems so much closer, I know. So keep this in mind. It's going to be a long road. Strap in. I'm not talking about the speech, I'm talking about the campaign. And enjoy it, because we learn a lot about ourselves as a nation. We get to know the people who are running actually pretty well. And I think what you see is what you get oftentimes. It's not like it's a big mystery. I think we get to know the people. And I think Americans are really good at picking presidents. I think we usually, almost always, make the right choice. And that's amazing, because not every country would even try this. But we believe in it. We do it regularly. It's part of who we are. It's something that makes our country special. Now, I think what we're hoping to convey tonight is when you get to know these guys a little bit more closely, you'll realize just how special this particular job is. That's the muscle portion of the program. Here come the brains.
I think there's a quote often probably misattributed to Mark Twain, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And so it's remarkable to me that the story we tell of what we call the President's Club was actually born in a moment that rhymes with this one. Many of you I know are following the refugee crisis in Europe very closely and with great concern for the hundreds of thousands of lives that are at risk at this extraordinary moment. And in fact, our story begins with the last such refugee crisis, right after, as World War II was ending, and as many as 100 million people in Europe were at risk of starvation. Europe was devastated. Agriculture had been wiped out. Rail lines were wiped out. People were walking between cities, desperately trying to find food. As many as a third of children in Belgium had tuberculosis. A quarter of the kids in Belgrade never made it to their first birthday. It was a terrible, devastating time. And poor Harry Truman had been in office for about an hour and a half. He had taken office in April of 1945. He had no idea, no one could have, how to cope with a crisis like that, and the possibility that more people could die in the aftermath of the war that had just ended than had died in it. Well, what a surprise it is that the one person who actually could help him know how to manage a crisis like that was the one who had helped Woodrow Wilson do it after World War I, and that was Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover, who had left office in 1933, the most hated man in America, with people pelting his motorcades with rotten fruit. The man who had been blamed for driving America into a depression, who had gone off into exile in the Waldorf Astoria and stewed for years as he watched the unfolding of this humanitarian crisis in Europe. Hoover cared deeply about humanitarian issues. It had been his passion throughout his life before and during his presidency. And Hoover was an engineer. He liked to fix things. He liked to solve problems. So Harry Truman, who did not care that Hoover was, as he described him, to the right of Louis XIV, secretly wrote Hoover a letter and asked him to come to the White House to meet with him. This is that picture when the two men met for the first time in April of 1945. By this time, it's May. And they're very suspicious of each other because they have absolutely nothing in common except agreeing that if someone did not do something to move the food from the countries that had it to the countries that needed it, that many, many, many people were going to die. So Truman gives Hoover a plane and a staff, sends him to 22 countries in 57 days. And in the course of the next year, these two men working together, meeting with, in Hoover's case, heads of state, prime ministers, 7 kings, the Pope, trying to negotiate that food be moved around, that borders be open, that the people who had the supplies shared it. These two men working together probably saved more lives than any two men in the 20th century. If that wasn't unusual enough, they then proceeded to collaborate in reorganizing the entire federal government. No one understood why a liberal Democrat like Truman would be willing to put a conservative Republican like Hoover in charge of a huge restructuring of what by then was the vast, sprawling American bureaucracy. But Truman by this time understood something about the presidency and what it does to you. And he knew that Hoover knew this too. Because Hoover had been president during a national crisis and had wrestled with having the tools that you need to cope with the demands of the job. And so those two men working together reorganized the entire government in a way that gave birth to the National Security Council, the Council on Economic Advisors, a unified Defense Department. Many of the agencies that we now take for granted in the structure of government was born of the Hoover Commission, which was the first time that two presidents got together to re-engineer the presidency itself. So by the time the two of them met up with each other at Eisenhower's inauguration, Hoover walked over and said, "I think we should organize a former president's club." And Truman said, "Great. You be the president of the club, I'll be the secretary." When Michael and I first started the research on this project many, many, many years ago, we talked about the President's Club as a shorthand. It was just our way of referring to pairs and trios and quartets of presidents. We didn't think it was a real thing until we started looking into the archives, reading the letters, listening to the phone calls, hearing them talk about, they used different language. One called it our exclusive trade union. One talked about our fraternity. Several of them talked about the President's Club. By 1957, they actually have sort of mailing rights and office help. When Lyndon Johnson is in office, he calls Harry Truman and he says, "I want you to know that as long as I am in this office, you are in it, and all of its rights and its purposes that are mine are yours, and your bedroom is at your disposal here in the White House anytime you need it. There are trinkets and tokens and cufflinks and golf balls that Kennedy sent to Eisenhower with the presidential seal." It was much more of a real thing than we ever really imagined until we heard them talking about it. It is not to say that it was always an entirely amicable relationship. Here you see President Eisenhower and President Truman, two men who worked very closely together following World War II with the demobilization of the military, with the creation of NATO. Truman thought, as the vast majority of Americans did, that Eisenhower was the great American of their lifetimes, and even said to him, "You know, you would be a great politician. If you decide you're interested in running," no one even knew what party Ike belonged to. "If you're interested in running," Truman told him, "I'll get out of the way. I'll even be your vice president." These two men worked very closely together all through 1945, right up until the 1952 campaign. Truman is not running again. Eisenhower throws his hat in the ring. I think today's candidates would whimper to realize that Eisenhower won the New Hampshire primary without ever visiting New Hampshire. And then this friendship goes horribly, horribly, horribly wrong when Truman listens to how Ike is campaigning. Ike didn't really know how to run for president. He had never run for anything before, and thought that he sold his soul, that he refused to denounce Senator McCarthy, that he refused to defend their great shared hero, George Marshall. Truman just was so disillusioned with how Eisenhower managed himself in that campaign that he started campaigning all over the country against Eisenhower. And it was such a bitter feud that when Ike was elected and the two men had to ride together to Eisenhower's inauguration, the stony silence in the limousine was the most awkward possible presidential encounter. And for the next 8 years, there was not so much as a birthday greeting from the White House to former President Truman. Except, there is something about holding the office that changes you. And by the time Eisenhower had served for 8 years, with all that that entailed, something had changed in him as well. And so the last time those two men met, actually, was at one of the saddest of all club reunions. It was when they shared a limousine together back from Arlington Cemetery, the burial of President Kennedy. And the two men are riding together in the twilight, and they're talking about their own lives and the attempts on their lives and how they wanted their funerals to go and how they wanted to be remembered and the kind of things that two old soldiers might talk about at that point. And by the time they got back to Blair House, where Truman was staying, he said to Eisenhower, "You want to come up for a drink?" And the two men ended up drinking the night away, and they reconciled. President Kennedy was the first president to have the club help him into office. You may recall the 1960 election was a rather close one. Kennedy, in fact, carried around in his pocket a piece of paper that said 118,574. That's how many votes he won by. And that's with a couple of Chicago precincts that only had 48 registered voters but registered 123 votes. So obviously a great many people were arguing that Vice President Nixon should challenge the results, that Kennedy had stolen this election. And Nixon called two people for advice. He called Herbert Hoover, and he called President Eisenhower. And both men, two Republicans, neither of whom had any desire to see Kennedy in the White House, told him, "Do not contest the results." There are too many countries around the world who are looking to America as a model for how democracies work and how peaceful changes of power work. And it is important. I think we're in enough trouble in the world today, Hoover said. It's important to show the unity and the peacefulness of transition. And Nixon, to his eternal credit, did not pursue the challenge to that vote. By the time Kennedy has been in office only for a few months and the Bay of Pigs disaster threatens to unwind his very young presidency, he asks Eisenhower, who he really didn't like very much. He called him names that I can't use in front of these young people. Eisenhower called him Little Boy Blue. But by the time Kennedy was in trouble as president, he asked Eisenhower to come and meet him at Camp David. Camp David, named after Eisenhower's grandson. When this picture was taken, this was the first time Kennedy had ever been to Camp David. Eisenhower had to show him around. And the two men walk the paths and they talk about the Bay of Pigs and what had gone wrong and how the planning had changed. And Eisenhower just grills him about how badly Kennedy had mismanaged the decision-making, except when it came time at the end for the two men to stand together in public in front of the cameras. Eisenhower was entirely supportive of the president, and the headline in the New York Times the next day was, "America must support our president. Ike urges U.S. to support Kennedy on Cuba." When Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson asked Eisenhower to come to Washington and see him that weekend. And so Eisenhower got in his car from his farm in Gettysburg and drove up to Washington, came to the White House, and wrote out in longhand what he thought Johnson needed to say to a joint session of Congress in order to signal to the world that the United States, that had just gone through this extraordinary trauma, was going to be able to maintain consistency of policy and stability. And the sight of Eisenhower with President Johnson at that time, and the counsel Eisenhower gave him continued throughout Johnson's presidency. He would actually ask Eisenhower to come sneak into Washington and come talk to me. He once called him the best chief of staff I've got. By the time President Nixon was running again in 1968, he did not share quite those warm feelings. The battle between Nixon and Johnson in the last days of the 1968 election is probably one of the most extraordinary chess matches ever played between two American presidents. Extraordinary because the stakes were so high and because both men cheated. At the time, Lyndon Johnson wanted to leave office having brought peace at the end of a war that had consumed his presidency. Nixon was afraid that Johnson would agree to anything to get a peace deal in Vietnam. And so Nixon, through some private back channels, signaled to the South Vietnamese, don't agree to come to the peace talks, don't agree to do anything, you'll get a better deal when I'm president. Lyndon Johnson, because he was, ironically enough, eavesdropping on President Nixon, found out about this and privately to his aides said, this is treason. He's interfering with American diplomacy. That is an act of treason. But Johnson understood in 1968, Martin Luther King had been murdered, Bobby Kennedy had been murdered, the streets of Chicago had burned, that charging a presidential candidate with treason, with trying to steal the presidency, was probably more than the country could bear. And so Johnson never told. Over and over again, even when these men were desperately at odds with each other, we saw them making decisions that put the country first, that put it ahead of their own political interest, put it ahead of their personal self-interest. And that was a pattern we saw and that continued with Michael's presidents.
Before we get to my president, we should just close the show right now. I mean, that was pretty good. I mean, can we leave my presidents on screen so that we don't have to look at me, first of all, because the pictures are more interesting. So, yep, just put the club. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the clubhouse. This is a place on Lafayette Square. Doesn't have a name, doesn't have four diamonds in front of it, but it's when Richard Nixon was president, Lyndon Johnson had gone back to Texas, and he was kind of restless, and he was calling all the time and coming to town, and finally Nixon said to a military aide, he said, just get him a place to stay. I don't care. I don't want him around. And so the military aide scarfed around the GSA and found this building. It was kind of run down on Lafayette Square, and he had it fitted out with some beds and some chairs, and that's where Johnson started staying. The military aide's name, by the way, was Colonel Brent Scowcroft. He has a very good memory, let me tell you. Very good memory. It now looks somewhat nicer due to the interventions of one of our guests here tonight. It's called Trowbridge House. It used to be owned by a naval captain. It has a very nice dining room and sitting there. And you can see upstairs in the main room, it has a pretty nice standalone bathtub. And there's the bed, which if you wake up in the next morning and you're not sure what job you had in a previous life, you can look down and see on the 600 count sheets what job you had. So it's there if you ever get the job, or if you've had it, you can go back, but you can't just check in. You have to call the White House. Footnote to history, Richard Nixon, though he created it for Johnson when he was a former president and would call Jimmy Carter to see if he could stay there himself. Carter almost always said no. This is a great little story about two men. Obviously, it would fall to Richard Nixon to resign. In 1974, he had to pick a vice president who he probably thought could do the job. He picked Gerald Ford. There was a lot of talk that a deal had been cut. It's pretty clear to me that this was just one of another great moments in American history where we were able to have a transition of power that would have been unthinkable in other countries, that the country rallied behind, and someone who had probably very little expectation of ever being president would go on to do a really great job for 2 years. Just a great story. These two men, by the way, met in 1946 when they were both first elected to Congress in the well of the House, and they would carpool together for most of 1947. It's amazing. By the way, we're entering the portion of the program where there are some presidents who are still alive. This is tricky for the speaker. if there are objections to anything that is said about anyone alive, I'm willing to take remarks, okay? Just stand up and correct me. I'll be fine. It's okay. I'll be good. This is a great moment in presidential history. It's on board Air Force One, the old 707, this is when President Reagan asked the former three presidents, Carter, Ford, and Nixon, to go to Cairo for the funeral of Anwar Sadat. None of these guys really liked each other, but they found themselves on a very cramped plane together for 18 hours. Two interesting things happened during this flight, this trip over the course of a weekend. It was a weird plane, by the way. Everyone was on it. Former secretaries of state, ambassadors, Stevie Wonder, an 11-year-old boy who had written Sadat some letters. I mean, it was like a rock star tour bus. And these three guys who have their own personal stories. Anyway, there was a crisis on the way over because Nixon, it turned out, had a secret mission plan to Saudi Arabia, and that upset the White House, and he peeled off. But on the way back, Ford and Carter, both of whom lost after one term in office or less, became friends. They realized they had a lot in common. They were both trying to build their libraries. They didn't like raising money, and they both really didn't like Ronald Reagan very much. So, for lots of reasons. So they kind of bonded, and over the next 25 or 30 years, those two men did about 25 projects together, and they became really good buddies, and both pledged to give the eulogy of the other at the funeral of whoever died first, which an honor that fell to Carter when Ford died in 2004. This is a picture of Jimmy Carter and President Bush. Carter's always a complicated partner for members of the President's Club. He is here pictured at the funeral of Martin Luther King's widow. Is that right? It was, yeah, Coretta Scott King, and I don't know what year this was. Carter's complicated, but he also redefined what it meant to be a former president. He oftentimes said, I'm a better former president than I was president, which isn't that surprising. He was a former president 7 times longer. But he did things that former presidents had never really done before, and made it kind of an institution. I think everyone has their eye on President Carter, who is, of course, now ailing with cancer, as they contemplate their own futures. And so he really redefined what it meant to be a former president. This is one of my favorite pictures. Most people think Bill Clinton and Ronald Reagan never met. They did once in Los Angeles. Clinton had just been reelected. He'd just been elected. He went to see Reagan in Century City. Great story. Clinton goes up to Reagan's office, and Clinton says, "Do you have any advice for me?" And Reagan says, "Well, go to Camp David. It'll be good for you." That was advice Clinton ignored. And he said, Reagan said, "I've been watching you on the campaign trail, Bill, and I gotta say, you don't know how to salute." And Clinton said, "Well, teach me." And so Reagan, who had not only been in the Army, but actually played an Army officer in 34 movies, was the perfect coach. So the two men stood up in Reagan's office, and Reagan sat there and taught Clinton how to salute. And he said, "You bring it up slowly, like it's covered with honey, and you shake it off fast like it's covered with something else." And they practiced their salutes in his office for some time. Membership in this club really does have its privileges. It's a great story. Oh, by the way, the jelly beans, that was Reagan's gift to Clinton, and Clinton kept them on his desk for 8 years. This is the strangest buddy movie of all times. These two men became friends. I don't quite understand, even now. It's kind of a mystery to me. But basically, when Clinton was elected, Nixon did everything he could to get on his schedule, to waved his arms, his hands, just please call me. When Clinton ignored him, then Nixon threatened Clinton by saying, "I'm going to start criticizing your presidency." He's trying to blackmail the new president to get a meeting. Anyway, they get together eventually, and Clinton eventually begins to rely on him, particularly for foreign policy advice, sends him on some missions. Nixon's really glad to be back, and they actually become unusual allies. The White House staff is horrified that this could possibly be happening, but like Truman and Hoover, we see over and over again, like Carter and Ford, sometimes presidents of different parties get along a lot better than presidents of the same parties. It's just an interesting dynamic, and it was true in this case. When Nixon died in 1994, Clinton actually told Larry King, "Sometimes I pick up the phone just to call him and I realize he's not there." So he really did have a kind of reliance on him. President Ford and Bill Clinton have another great story. When Bill Clinton was obviously impeached in the House and on trial for the Senate, he was constantly trying to cut a deal to keep that from happening. At one point, he appeals to President Ford to try to make the case. Actually, he asks Ford to be his character witness in the House. And Ford says, "I'll help you, but don't ask me to do that." and finally, Ford says to Clinton, "You know, I think if you just admit that you lied about your relationship with Monica Lewinsky, they'd forgive you." And Clinton says, "I can't go there." And so, but they actually had this extended negotiation that Ford tried to make with Clinton to cut a deal. I think in part because he felt he hadn't quite handled the pardon perfectly, and he wanted to get it right. But in a surprise, again, across parties. We have, in our own history, had an amazing thing happen. We've had a father and a son in the White House in a very short period of time. Obviously, this is a relationship about which I know more than anyone else in the room. So it's natural that I should be talking about it. But I think that there was a lot of kabuki in the commentary about George W. Bush and George Herbert Walker Bush, about one son and the father, and trying to repeat or not repeat things that had gone before. And I think that just so overlooks the obvious part of a relationship that anyone who has a child, or much less sons, and I have 3, has with anyone who is now in power, and that is you just root for them. And I think that what happens in so many times is that you just root for your child and everyone thinks something nefarious is going on. And I think one of the things George W. Bush told us when we asked him about this was, look, I was less worried about this than my father. He was the one I had to call up and say, don't worry, I'm fine, I'm fine. And which, of course, reminds me of what's going on in my house on any given evening. So to me, this was just a normal family story, and to me, a part of the club that we will never probably see, at least for 400 days. So, okay. This is another really unusual relationship about which, again, I'm the expert. Bill Clinton comes into office and having defeated George Herbert Walker Bush, and immediately finds that he needs his help on NAFTA, on Middle East stuff, and turns to him very early in his presidency for assistance. And George Herbert Walker Bush responded. Clinton did not forget it. He knew that this was a difficult thing to do, and he was always there for him. When both men are out of office, it falls to George W. Bush to pair them up and put them to work, which turned out to work great. They worked on the tsunami that was about 2000, I want to say 5. They would work on Hurricane Katrina. Was it Katrina? There's so many hurricanes, I lose track. Katrina in 2007. And they would raise millions of dollars together, and they would decide how to spend it together, which must have been just a blast. Must have been fun to suddenly have $200 or $300 million to spend on nothing but good works in places that you both had connections to. Don't forget, both men had spent a lot of time in the Gulf Coast. President Bush, of course, had lived in Houston and had business in the Gulf. And if you were Bill Clinton living in Arkansas, New Orleans was like, that was downtown. So both men knew the region, both men were tied to it, and they became really good friends. And it's one of my favorite stories, again, across parties. This is a picture we gotta leave this picture up because there's first of all, look at the close eye contact here. I mean, this is a close relationship. And the handshake, that is two-fisted, isn't it? Yeah, that's a special bond there. It's not easy following someone in your own party. That's tough. That's a tough road. And a lot of people, we now know after almost 8 years of President Obama and 8 years of Bill Clinton that they're two really different Democrats. Really different. Everyone thinks it was a continuation. There's nothing that's the same about these two guys. And let me just talk about it for a second. They both have really different views about how to govern. Bill Clinton thought, and I think it's fair to say, but Bill Clinton thought that you build a coalition from in the center. That's how he ran. That's how he tried to govern. Certainly, a Democrat hasn't tried to balance a budget or pass a crime bill a trade bill or a welfare reform before or since for 30 or 40 years. So he governed from the center, and Obama said, no, 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 no. No, you govern from the left. And both have had some success. But these are two clans, two men who never really got along. You remember when Hillary ran against Obama in 2008, Obama wrote a book saying that the Clintons were from an older generation, that it forged its politics in the dorm rooms of the 60s. And I'm sure the Clintons listened to Obama say that, and they said, have you met any Republicans? Every time Obama talked about post-partisanship, Hillary and Bill must have said, really? Post-partisanship? Let me introduce you to some of the people in Congress. So they have really different ideas about how to govern, and that exists now, and it will be interesting in the next couple of weeks or days, if Joe Biden gets into the race, which role he will play. But again, it's unfolding right before our very eyes. So even past his prologue here, and as the Democratic race gets richer and more interesting, literally in the next couple of days or weeks, we're going to see perhaps a whole new way of governing or trying to govern as a Democrat. This is our last picture, and it's one of my favorites. Nancy and I were in Dallas about 6 weeks ago, and on the cover of Time, we put two of these men, Clinton and George W., together because we'd long thought they were the most interesting two of this group. This is an interesting collection of men, the club at moment, but to some extent, the two most interesting are George W. Bush and Bill Clinton. They are, perhaps with one exception, the two most closely born presidents in American history, 6 weeks apart in 1946. That's, I think Jackson and another president were maybe a day or two closer. They represent very different political ideas. They represent culturally kind of different, poles of the baby boom generation. But they too, in the last couple of years, have become friends and allies, and they have worked on things together, and they have traveled together. They also both have a sibling in this race. So when we realized that that was going to unfold in one great dynastic smackdown, Nancy and I said, let's get the two of them together talking about it. So we went down to Dallas and got them to sit down, and they said, well, this is a really interesting situation we're in now. Do you want to is there something else you just want? My memories fade. That conversation was so interesting, and it went by so fast. But both men said, here's my favorite part of the conversation. At one point, George W. Bush said, yeah, we both had 2 terms. We have that in common. And we were both good politicians. And I kept thinking, yeah, and maybe you think you were really good at that. And then they said, and we both know that we have to sit this round out. We can't really play on this one the way we did before. We have to step back. And they kept saying, we're old guard, we're over the hill. And it's got to be hard. It's got to be hard just to pull back, to not watch, to not get invested. And they're trying. We'll see how they do. One more thing about this picture. Everyone makes fun of how Carter's a little bit at a distance, but it's partly his nature. But I love something different about this picture, and that's this. Look, a couple of years ago, the French elected, after they threw out Nicolas Sarkozy and elected François Hollande, there was all this talk in the French newspapers about how, thank God, Hollande is in. Because Hollande went to the right schools, and he came from the right family, and he trained in the right places. And, that Sarkozy guy, he liked Americans, and, he came from a different class, and he came from a different part of France than where we normally have presidents come from. And I look at this picture and I think, well, there isn't a club in America that would have all those guys as a member. But we made this club. We chose them. We decided who was in it. They didn't, we did, which is the cool thing about this country. We get to decide who's in it, and there aren't a lot of countries that would have put that collection together and said, not only are we going to put them together, we're going to make them our leaders. And that's what makes America strong and amazing and different and special. And so the club is in some ways as interesting as it is about the relationships between these two or these three or this party and that party. What it really is revealing is how amazing the country is to be able to choose its own leaders, to choose from such a wide variety, and then to have them all be with us for so long after they leave office, which is both great for them and lucky for us. I think this concludes that's it. That's the message. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Nancy and Michael, and I highly recommend this book to all of you if you haven't read it. It's just a wonderful story. It's full of the things they talked about tonight. There are 10 times those great stories in the book, and I learned so much from reading it. And I just want to say how really honored and fortunate we are, as Michael said, to have a former president, a member of that exclusive club with us, and the nobility that that office has brought out in our leaders, and he certainly is an exemplar of that. So President Bush, again, thank you so much for all you've done. President Bush just showed us he does know how to salute, so we appreciate that. We'd like to ask, as President and Mrs. Bush and our guests leave, if you would remain, and we will announce when it's time for you to leave the hall. So thank you for your patience.